Bransen from GMAT Ninja here, and welcome to another episode in our GMAT and Executive Assessment Critical Reasoning series. In this episode, we're going to tackle one of the most common reasons that we see students mistakenly eliminate correct answer choices, which is because these answer choices, they say, are irrelevant or out of scope. So, a few things to start off here before we dive into a few questions that we're going to take a look at. But first thing is this: is there are good ways and there are bad ways to eliminate answer choices. And we often talk about eliminating answer choices, and not all ways of eliminating answer choices are the same. So there are good reasons, good ways, bad ways to eliminate answer choices. And basically stating that an answer choice is irrelevant or out of scope is a bad way to eliminate an answer choice and a bad reason to eliminate an answer choice. And one reason why is it's really easy just to say, well, that's irrelevant, that's out of scope, when it's not actually irrelevant or it's not actually out of scope. So we also encourage students that if you're going to say something is irrelevant or out of scope, because it's not unheard of that an answer choice would not have a huge impact on an argument, but you want to be able to state why. So if something's truly irrelevant, you don't just want to say, well, that's irrelevant, that's out of scope. You want to be able to say, well, this doesn't have a huge impact on the argument for this reason, and be able to state why an answer choice doesn't impact an argument. And if you're able to articulate that, then that's a much better reason to eliminate an answer choice than just saying, well, that's irrelevant or that's out of scope. And finally, I want to talk about what's really important is being able to tie answer choices back into the passage. How does this impact the heart of the passage? How does this impact the main conclusion? What does this do to the reasoning of the argument? You want to tie answer choices back into a passage, and I like to summarize it just in terms of implications. You really want to think about what are the implications of this answer choice for the argument. If you're saying, well, this is irrelevant or out of scope, you've basically said that it has no implication on the argument. It doesn't affect the argument at all. And while it's true that occasionally there are answer choices that, well, it doesn't really have a huge impact on an argument, you want to be able to articulate why that's the case when that is the case. We're going to go ahead and we're going to take a look at a few answer choices. At a few questions here. We're going to take a look at 3 total in this video, and we're going to start with an abbreviated question. I'm going to go ahead and pop it up on the screen, and after I pop it up on the screen, I'm going to give you a minute to work through it, and we'll come back and we'll talk about it together on the board. So go ahead and take a look at this one. Awesome. Hopefully you've had a second to work through this one. The passage basically is an argument from the Springfield Fire Commissioner. What it says is this: the vast majority of false fire alarms are prank calls made anonymously from fire alarm boxes on street corners. Since virtually everyone has access to a private telephone, these alarm boxes have outlived their usefulness. Therefore, we propose to remove the boxes. Removing the boxes will reduce the number of prank calls without hampering people's ability to report a fire. Now, first, I want to obviously identify really what the heart of this passage is. And so the heart of this passage here, which is really a conclusion, and the conclusion that the Springfield Fire Commissioner comes to is found in the last sentence. Removing, and I'll go ahead and write this up here. It says that removing the boxes will reduce the number of prank calls. So removing the boxes will reduce the number of prank calls without hampering people's ability to report a fire. People's ability to report a fire. And again, this really here is a conclusion. Now, why does the Springfield Fire Commissioner come to this conclusion? Well, really the support that we have is found a little bit earlier in the passage. The vast majority of fire alarm prank calls are made anonymously from fire alarm boxes on street corners. So, majority of fire alarm prank calls are made anonymously from alarm boxes on street corners. And we're told that virtually everyone has access to a private telephone. So, virtually everyone has access to a private telephone. So these two statements ultimately support the conclusion. There's a little bit more information in the passage, and I've abbreviated a few things in here, which again, we want you to keep things in their words and not take things necessarily into your own words. But this essentially captures support. Okay, majority of fire alarm prank calls are made anonymously from alarm boxes on street corners, and everyone has access to a telephone, private telephone. So the boxes will reduce the number of prank calls without hampering people's. Removing the boxes will reduce the number of prank calls without hampering people's ability to report a fire. So the question then says, which of the following, if true, most strongly supports the claim that the proposal, if carried out, will have the announced effect? Very important here that I go ahead and identify right from the get-go what is the announced effect. Well, the announced effect is that removing the boxes will do two things. It'll reduce the number of prank calls, and it will not hamper people's ability to report a fire. With that in mind, I go to the answer choices. A says the fire department traces all alarm calls made from private telephones and records where they came from. Well, this one really doesn't have a huge impact on the argument because private telephones, the argument's really about the alarm boxes, and so I can eliminate A right from the get-go. B, a telephone can provide the fire department with more information about the nature and size of a fire than can an alarm placed from an alarm box. Now, that actually looks tempting when I first read it, because if it can provide the fire department with more information than can an alarm placed from an alarm box, it makes me think, well, that's probably better for the fire department. But does it really suggest that it'll have the announced effect that it will reduce the number of prank calls? Well, that does nothing to suggest that it'll reduce the number of prank calls. And it also doesn't suggest that it will not hamper people's ability to report a fire. maybe it says that the fire department will get better information, but that's not the announced effect. So I can eliminate B because that doesn't have anything to do with the announced effect. If I think about the implications, again, great, it provides more information and it gives you more information about the nature and the size of the fire than the alarm box. That's wonderful for the fire department, but that still doesn't say anything about hampering people's ability to report a fire or reducing the number of prank calls. And with C, responding to false alarms significantly reduces the fire department's capacity for responding to fires. Well, again, that's another reason that I think removing the boxes is a good idea, but the announced effect of the proposal to remove the boxes is that removing the boxes will reduce the number of prank calls without hampering people's ability to report a fire. That just tells me that it's going to enable the department to do more. It doesn't tell me about people's ability to report a fire, and it doesn't tell me about reducing the number. It doesn't tell me that removing the boxes will reduce the number of prank calls. So I can eliminate C. Now, what you'll see here is that I've played a little bit of a cruel trick on you, and that one of these, obviously we've eliminated all three, so one of these is actually the right answer here. But it's actually going to be A here, and I want to take another look at A. Because you'll notice that when I went through A, and I went through it kind of quickly, I just said, well, the fire department traces all alarm calls made from private telephones and records where they came from. A passage isn't really about private telephones, it's about alarm boxes. But that actually is another version of just saying, well, hey, that's irrelevant, that's out of scope. This is about the alarm boxes, not about the private telephones. And it's something we see people do a lot on this question, is they look at this question and, well, that which happens to be the right answer here, A happens to be the right answer here, it seems like it's irrelevant. It seems like it's out of scope. It seems like the whole passage is about alarm boxes, so why would the right answer be about private telephones? But if you think about the implications of it, and like I said at the beginning, tie it back into the passage, well, if the fire department traces all alarm calls made from private telephones and records where they came from, then that actually gives me more reason to believe that it will reduce the number of prank calls. Because one of the things that we learned earlier in the passage in the support, and this was a small detail, which maybe if you were converting things into your own words, you missed out on this, and this was a small detail, but it says the majority of fire alarm prank calls are made anonymously from alarm boxes. So now all of a sudden people can't make those prank calls anonymously. They're going to be caught making those prank calls because they're making them from private telephones, and we can record where it came from. And so this actually the idea that we're going to reduce the number of prank calls, which is supporting the claim, the announced effect, that it'll reduce the number of prank calls without hampering people's ability to report a fire. Which another is that the advantages of the alarm boxes was that the alarm boxes were presumably near the fire, but if we can also trace where the private telephones come from, then that's also presumably near the fire. So for those reasons, A is actually the best answer choice here. And again, a lot of this, first of all, it all starts with, well, you've got to identify the heart of the passage, which this really is the heart of the passage. Of course, from this fact, you could argue, well, the Springfield Fire Commissioner then says that we propose to remove the boxes. But really the main point is, hey, this is what's going to happen when we remove the boxes. Remove the boxes, this will happen. It will reduce the number of prank calls and not hamper people's ability to report a fire. But you can see here how A, very easy to say, well, that's irrelevant. That's about private telephones. The passage is really all about, the passage here is really all about these alarm boxes, but it's not actually irrelevant when you think about, or out of scope when you think about the implications that it has on it. I want to go ahead and I want to take a look at another passage. I'm going to pop it up on the screen, give you a little bit of time to work through it. And again, remember, don't eliminate anything because it's irrelevant, out of scope. Think about how you can tie things back into the passage and how things are connected. I'll go ahead and pop it up on the screen, give you a moment to work through it, and then we'll come back and we'll talk about it together. Awesome. Hopefully you've had a second to work through this one. Let's talk through the passage here first. It says lobsters and other crustaceans eaten by humans are more likely to contract gill diseases when sewage contaminates their water. Under a recent proposal, millions of gallons of local sewage each day would be rerouted many kilometers offshore. Although this would substantially reduce the amount of sewage in the harbor where lobsters are caught, the proposal is pointless because hardly any lobsters live long enough to be harmed by those diseases. Okay, so let's start off here by identifying again what is the heart of the passage. Really the heart of the passage here, what everything's building towards, is the author's statement that the proposal is pointless. So what proposal? Well, the proposal to remove the, so this is the conclusion, the proposal to remove the sewage this many kilometers offshore. That's the conclusion. Now, why does the author arrive at that conclusion? Well, there's a lot of background information given early in the passage, which is that lobsters, other crustaceans eaten by humans are more likely to contract gill disease, which all that's important stuff. I don't want to ignore that, but really the primary support for this conclusion is, why is it pointless? Well, because hardly any lobsters live long enough to be harmed by those diseases. So that is all really the support in the conclusion in the passage, and then I'm given a bunch of other background information. I'm not going to write all that down really for the sake of time, but that doesn't mean that other background information, the first two sentences there and the first clause of the third sentence is not important. It is important. But let's go ahead here and write up A, B, C, D, E, and we'll talk through the question and the answer choices. Now, the question says this: which one of the following, if true, most seriously weakens the argument? And A says, contaminants in the harbor other than sewage are equally harmful to lobsters. Okay, well, let's think about, again, tie things back into the passage. I want to think about the implications of that statement on the argument as a whole. So if contaminants in the harbor other than sewage are equally harmful to lobsters, doesn't mean that it's pointless to remove the sewage. Actually, that kind of strengthens the argument, because if there are other contaminants that are equally harmful, then why remove the sewage? Right? It kind of strengthens the idea that the proposal is pointless. It definitely doesn't weaken the argument. Kind of makes me think, well, yeah, the proposal is pointless because the lobsters are going to be harmed anyway by these other contaminants. So I can go ahead and eliminate A. Definitely doesn't weaken the argument. Take a look at B here. Lobsters, like other crustaceans, live longer in the open ocean than in industrial harbors. Okay, so again, I want to think about the implications. Lobsters live longer in the open ocean, which means maybe in the open ocean they would live long enough to be harmed by the diseases. So maybe that's a reason that I shouldn't move the sewage from the harbor to the open ocean. So that, again, actually kind of strengthens the argument. In fact, not only does it make it seem like the proposal is pointless, it makes it seem like the proposal is harmful, because now we're going to take it from where lobsters don't live long enough to be harmed to where lobsters maybe possibly do live long enough to be harmed. Don't know if they do. But again, if anything, I think that strengthens the argument, definitely doesn't weaken the argument. So I can go ahead and I can eliminate B. With C, lobsters breed as readily in sewage-contaminated water as in unpolluted water. Well, again, doesn't weaken the argument. Makes me think, well, they don't have any problems. Because maybe you can make the argument, well, they aren't harmed by the diseases, but they don't breed well in contaminated water, so we should remove the sewage. But this comes along and says, well, actually, they do breed as readily in sewage contaminated water as in unpolluted water. They're just as fine in sewage contaminated water. So again, it makes me think proposal's kind of pointless, kind of strengthens the argument, which I want to be careful here, because a lot of these I'm going along and being like, well, yeah, that kind of strengthens. Even if an answer choice doesn't strengthen, it just doesn't weaken. Even if a statement's neutral, that still doesn't weaken the argument. So even if you don't think, well, I don't want you to get in the mindset, well, I want to find 4 answers here that strengthen the argument and eliminate all of them, because there may not be 4 answers that strengthen the argument. There may be just a statement that's neutral. It doesn't weaken or strengthen. That would still be wrong. Now with D here, it says this: gill diseases cannot be detected by examining the surface of the lobsters. Okay. So if gill diseases can't be detected by examining the surface of the lobsters, that means I have to detect it in some other way. But it seems like from the argument, I have been able to detect it, maybe by taking some sort of sample of lobster flesh or something like that. Seems like I can determine it somehow. So, okay, can't be determined by examining the surface, but I don't think I need to detect it by examining the surface. So I can go ahead and I can eliminate D. Now, E says this: humans often become ill as a result of eating lobsters with gill diseases. Okay, so my instinct there is, if I'm following not great process, is out of scope, irrelevant. We're not talking about humans, we're talking about lobsters. But remember, I want to tie this back into the passage. The main conclusion of the passage is the proposal is pointless. If I think about the background information that I'm given at the beginning of this passage, I'm told that lobsters and other crustaceans eaten by humans. So humans do eat these lobsters and other crustaceans. And I'm told here that humans become ill as a result of eating lobsters with gill disease. Well, all of a sudden, this makes me think that maybe the proposal isn't pointless, because maybe it may not help the lobsters because they don't live long enough to be harmed by those diseases anyway, but it may help humans because these humans are eating the lobsters, which the lobsters weren't harmed by the disease, but the humans are getting ill because they're eating lobsters. So I should actually remove the sewage from the harbor and maybe take it out in the open ocean. So maybe that all of a sudden it's like the proposal has a point. The point isn't necessarily to protect the lobsters, the point is to protect humans. And so E makes me think the proposal is not pointless, and E weakens the argument. Again, the reason that I like to go over this question is this: is so many students look at E and say, well, that's about humans, passage about lobsters, irrelevant, out of scope, that doesn't matter, right? And you can't do that, because when you do that, all of a sudden you haven't thought about the implications. And when you really think about the implications of E, okay, yeah, the passage is all about lobsters, but those lobsters ultimately have an effect on the humans that eat them, and it makes me think the proposal is not pointless. I want to go ahead and take a look at one more. Remember, again, try not to eliminate anything because it's irrelevant or out of scope. Think about the implications and try and tie answer choices back into the passage, see how things affect each other. Let's go ahead and take a look at this one, take a moment to work through it, and then we'll come back and talk about it together. Awesome. Hopefully you've had a minute to work through this one. Let's go ahead and talk about the passage together. So it says, it is from an educational theorist. It says, recent editorials have called for limits on the amount of homework assigned to school children younger than 12. They point out that free time activities play an important role in childhood development and that homework in large quantities can severely restrict children's free time, hindering their development. But the actual average homework time for children under 12, a little more than 30 minutes per night, leaves plenty of free time. In reality, therefore, the editorial's rationale cannot justify the restriction they advocate. So I'm going to start here by identifying really what the heart of the passage is, which is really that last sentence. So I can say that the conclusion here is that the editorials rationale cannot justify the restriction they advocate. Now, I also want to identify what support is given in the passage for that. And really the support in the passage is this, the sentence right before the conclusion, where it tells me that the average homework time for children under 12, the actual average homework time for children under 12, a little more than 30 minutes per night, leaves plenty of free time. So average homework time for children under 12, 30 minutes per night, which actually, technically, I should keep it in their own words, and it says little more than 30 minutes per night, so a little more than 30 minutes per night. Leaves plenty of free time. And then, of course, there's the whole first part of the passage, which I don't want to leave out in just for the sake of focusing on what I want to focus on here in this video. But the first part of the passage is really important too. It talks about what those editorials have called for, the limits on the amount of homework for children younger than 12, and why, because free time is super important in childhood development, and it severely restricts their free time, which hinders their development. So there is that whole thing that's going on, which really kind of ultimately serves as some background for this argument and supports this argument as well. But anyway, the question here says this. So I'll go ahead and put up A, B, C, D, E. I'm going to try and tie all these answer choices back into the passage, see what the implications are. Not going to say anything's irrelevant out of scope here. Which of the following, if true, would most seriously call into question the educational theorist's conclusion? Again, what is that conclusion? Well, that the editorial's rationale cannot justify the restriction they advocate. And just because I have a lot of general terms in here, I'm going to bring things into my own words. I'm going to be very deliberate about the fact that I brought this into my own words. But in other words, I could say that the conclusion is no restriction on homework is needed. Which again, that's in my own words, and I need to be very cautious about that, because really there's a lot more to it than, like, technically I'd say the editorial's rationale. So it's not really saying that there's no restriction needed. It's really saying that with that current rationale, it doesn't justify the restriction. So there's a little bit more to it than that, but that's just kind of in my own words. The way that I think about this conclusion is that really the author's saying no restriction on the amount of homework is needed. Now, A says, some teachers give us homework assignments work of a kind that research suggests is most effective educationally when done in class. So if most if some teachers give us homework assignments, work of a kind that research suggests is most effective educationally when done in class, then okay, that does make me think that we should probably shift certain homework into classwork. But at the same time, it doesn't necessarily make me think that there's it doesn't necessarily call into question the idea that there's a restriction needed on the amount of time based on the logic of the editorials. In other words, this is presenting a different logic than the logic of the editorials. The logic of the editorials was homework's taking up too much time. A is saying, well, maybe the homework would be better, more effective if they did it in class. Okay, that's great. So maybe we should shift some of the homework to classwork. But that's not in line with the editorial's rationale. And again, that was the conclusion, was that the editorial's rationale cannot justify the restriction, which again is why I said, this is my words, this is their words. Their words are important here. In other words, A gives me no reason to think that the editorial's rationale actually holds up now, that there's too much homework. It makes me think, well, maybe it's more effective done in class, but it doesn't make me think that there's too much homework. So for that reason, I can eliminate A. With B, for children younger than 12, regularly doing homework in the first years of school has no proven academic value, but many educators believe it fosters self-discipline and time management. Well, again, so kind of with the first part of the argument, first part of B, I have the same thing as what I had with A. So it has no proven academic value. Okay, that's maybe another reason to restrict homework, but it's not the editorial's rationale. So I've got to pay close attention to the wording of the conclusion. And the second part of B makes me think that if it fosters self-discipline and time management, that's another reason that I wouldn't want to restrict the amount of homework. So B, I could probably go either way. I definitely don't think that it seriously calls into question the educational theorists. I could probably go either way on homework, but it still is in line with the conclusion of the educational theorists. So I'm going to eliminate B. C says some homework assignments are related to free time activities that that children engage in, such as reading or hobbies. Well, that actually, again, makes me think if these homework assignments are kind of related to free time activities, that makes me think that they're on the right track with the homework assignments and that they are what they should be. So, and they're related to reading and hobbies, which that, of course, fosters development. So maybe even the homework assignments are helping foster development similar to free time activities. So another reason that I think that, okay, I don't actually need a restriction because the homework is actually helping. So again, it kind of falls in line with the author's conclusion, and I can eliminate C for that reason. D, a substantial proportion of school children under 12, particularly those in their first full years of school, have less than 10 minutes of homework assigned per night. Well, we already know that, is what my initial response would be. But I want to think about the implications of that. Because if a substantial proportion of school children, particularly those in their first few years of school, have less than 10 minutes of homework assigned per night, then for the average to be a little more than 30 minutes per night, the other proportion, which is a small, maybe substantial proportion, so we have a smaller proportion, or who knows whether it's smaller or bigger, but just another proportion that is going to have way more than 30 minutes of homework if I'm going to make the total average come back down to 30. So even though my instinct here would be to say, well, we already know that, which is kind of another version of, well, that's irrelevant, that's out of scope, we already know that. It actually, if I give some pause and I think about the implications, it actually means that, okay, it may average out around 30, but that's because a ton are doing way less than, or doing even less than 10 minutes per night. So there must be another group who's doing way more than 30 to make the average come down to 30. that starts to call into question the reasoning of the educational theorist, because if a substantial proportion have more than 30, well, the educational theorist was just looking at the average. And maybe the restriction generally isn't necessary for everybody, but we actually do need to put the restriction in place because there's some students that are having way too much homework and we need to protect them. So D gives me reason to call into question the educational theorist's conclusion. I'll keep it in. With E, it says some free time activities teach children skills or information that they later find useful in their schoolwork. Now, here, if these free time activities teach children skills or information that they later find useful in their schoolwork, plenty of reason for me to believe that, additional reason for me to believe that free time's good and that it's helpful. But again, it doesn't give me reason to question that the restriction's kind of unnecessary, because we already have people who are doing just over 30 minutes, which isn't 30 minutes, not that much, just over 30 minutes of homework per night. So we don't actually have to worry about those students or worry about putting in place a restriction. So it doesn't give me any reason to call into question the author's argument, so I can eliminate E, and D here is the best answer choice. Now, let me just summarize here for a moment, because really the theme and hopefully what you got out of this video was that you don't want to eliminate answer choices because they're irrelevant or because they're out of scope. You really want to tie things back into the passage. And there are other ways. Just because you don't say irrelevant or out of scope doesn't mean you haven't done the same thing, right? You can say that doesn't matter, or that doesn't impact the argument, or right. You want to be able to state why it's irrelevant, why it's out of scope, why it doesn't have an impact on the argument, or even like we saw in that last question, students will, well, the argument already said that. Did it really? And really think about the implications of how tying things back into the passage, thinking about the implications and thinking about how things are connected. I hope this video has been helpful to you, and I hope that you'll continue to stay tuned to the rest of our critical reasoning series. Make sure that you keep these strategies in mind when you're working on critical reasoning on the GMAT or the executive assessment.